If you vanished today, we'd probably celebrate, Nathan said with a smirk, raising his beer bottle toward me across the picnic table. The whole family erupted in laughter, his wife Jessica snorting into her iced tea, my mother-in-law Patricia clapping her hands, and even Marcus chuckling beside me. Everyone except me. I quietly finished chewing my barbecue sandwich and set it down on my paper plate. The afternoon sun beat down on the backyard in Phoenix, Arizona, where the Bennett family had gathered for their annual reunion. 37 relatives sprawled across lawn chairs and picnic tables, their voices carrying over the sound of children splashing in the pool. Interesting theory, I said calmly, dabbing my mouth with a napkin. Nathan's grin widened. Come on, Eve, you know we're just kidding. But seriously, Marcus would probably get more done without you hogging the computer all day. More laughter rippled through the group. I watched Marcus nod along, his sales-trained smile never faltering. He was probably thinking about how this played into his narrative. The successful salesman married to the quirky wife who played on computers while he brought home the real money. If only they knew. My phone buzzed with a notification from my business account. Another payment had cleared, $15,000 from Gravora Group for the custom inventory management system I delivered last week. I glanced at the amount and slipped the phone back into my purse without mentioning it. Why would I? According to everyone here, I just did computer stuff from home. Remember when Eve tried to explain her work at Christmas? Jessica chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. Something about databases and cloud computing. I think she lost us after hello. Patricia nodded enthusiastically. Thank goodness Marcus has a real job to support the family. I don't know what we'd do if we all had to depend on whatever it is you do, dear. I took a sip of my lemonade and let the words wash over me. They had no idea that their real job son had been 3 months behind on the mortgage until I quietly transferred money to cover it. They didn't know that the lavish family cruise they'd taken last spring was funded by my computer stuff. They certainly didn't realize that Nathan's construction business had stayed afloat because I'd co-signed a loan for him 6 months ago, a favor Marcus had begged me to do without telling his family where the financial backing actually came from. The conversation moved on to other topics, but something had crystallized in that moment. These people saw me as dead weight, a burden on their precious Marcus. In their minds, I was the lucky wife who got to ride his coattails while contributing nothing of value. I finished my plate in silence, watching them all laugh and joke, completely oblivious to the fact that they were mocking their own financial lifeline. Growing up, I'd always been the quiet one who preferred computers to people. While other kids played outside, I was teaching myself programming languages and building websites for local businesses. By the time I graduated from Arizona State University, I'd already launched my consulting firm, Oakenlight Publishing, though it handled far more than publishing these days. Marcus and I met 5 years ago at a coffee shop near his office. He was charming, confident, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most interesting person in the room. He sold medical equipment to hospitals and made decent money, around $70,000 a year. I was impressed by his ambition and the way he talked about his close-knit family. "They're going to love you," he'd said, after we'd been dating for 3 months. "My mom always says I need someone to keep me grounded." The first time I met the Bennetts, I was nervous but excited. I'd dressed carefully, brought homemade cookies, and prepared myself to talk about my work if anyone asked. But when Patricia introduced me to the extended family, she said, "This is Eve, Marcus's girlfriend. She does something with computers." I'd opened my mouth to explain that I owned a software consulting business, but Marcus had jumped in. "She's really talented with technology, always helping me figure out my laptop problems." The conversation quickly shifted to Marcus's latest sales achievements, and I found myself nodding along as he described closing deals and exceeding quotas. Nobody asked about my business again. When we got married 2 years later, Marcus suggested I keep my maiden name for business purposes, which seemed thoughtful at the time. What I didn't realize was that it allowed him to maintain the fiction that his success was entirely his own. He'd tell people we were both doing well, but somehow the focus always landed on his career. Our house in Phoenix was beautiful, a 4-bedroom ranch with a pool and a view of the mountains. Marcus loved hosting family gatherings there, playing the role of the successful provider. He'd give tours of our home office, pointing out my dual monitors and making jokes about my fancy computer setup. "Eve's got her little business thing going," he'd say with affectionate condescension. "Keeps her busy while I'm out closing deals." What they didn't see were the invoices on my desk, the contracts with major corporations, the bank statements showing monthly deposits that dwarfed Marcus's commission checks. My little business thing had generated over $400,000 last year alone. I'd tried to correct the narrative a few times, but Marcus would get uncomfortable when I mentioned specific numbers or client names. "You don't want to sound like you're bragging," he'd whisper later. "My family's not really into that whole corporate thing." So I learned to stay quiet, to let him have his moment in the spotlight. But today, listening to Nathan's joke and watching everyone laugh at the idea of my disappearance being a cause for celebration, I realized something important. They genuinely believed I was expendable. The drive home from the reunion was quiet. Marcus hummed along to the radio, occasionally commenting on his cousin's new truck or his aunt's terrible potato salad. He seemed oblivious to my silence, which wasn't unusual. After 5 years together, he'd grown accustomed to my reserved nature at family gatherings. "That was fun," he said, as we pulled into our driveway. "Mom looked really happy. I think she's finally warming up to you." I unlocked the front door without responding. Inside, the house felt different somehow, like I was seeing it through new eyes. This beautiful home that Marcus loved to show off. This life we'd built together. All of it rested on a foundation of lies and assumptions. In my office, I sat down at my computer and opened my business accounts. 3 pending invoices totaled $47,000. My savings account showed a balance of $230,000. The joint checking account that Marcus believed held our money contained mostly my deposits, with his contributions covering maybe 30% of our monthly expenses. I pulled up the mortgage statement. We'd bought the house 3 years ago, with a down payment that came entirely from my business savings, though Marcus had signed the paperwork and handled the realtor meetings. To his family, he was the homeowner who'd graciously allowed his wife to contribute where she could. My phone rang. A client calling about a rush project. I spent 45 minutes discussing database architecture and timeline requirements, quoting a price that would cover Marcus's salary for 6 months. When I hung up, Marcus poked his head into the office. "Work call?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Just some computer stuff," I replied, watching his face. He nodded and disappeared back down the hallway. The irony wasn't lost on me. He showed more interest in his fantasy football league than in the business that funded his lifestyle. That evening, as we sat on the couch watching television, I found myself studying Marcus objectively. He was a good man in many ways, kind to animals, helpful to elderly neighbors, generous with friends. But he'd built his identity around being the provider, the successful husband with the supportive wife. The truth, that I out-earned him by a factor of 5, didn't fit his narrative. "Nathan was pretty funny today," Marcus said during a commercial break. "I love how he can just cut right through tension with a joke." "Tension?" I asked. "You seemed a little quiet at dinner. I thought maybe you were feeling left out of the conversation." I stared at him for a long moment. He genuinely believed his brother's comment about celebrating my disappearance was just harmless fun. He didn't see the cruelty in it, the dismissiveness, the way it revealed how little they all valued my presence in their lives. "Maybe I was," I said softly. That night, as Marcus slept beside me, I lay awake thinking about Nathan's words. They'd probably celebrate if I vanished. Well, perhaps it was time to test that theory. The next morning, I woke up with unusual clarity. Marcus had already left for work, his coffee mug abandoned in the sink and his breakfast dishes scattered across the counter. A typical Monday morning in our house. He rushed off to his important sales meetings while I stayed home to do my computer stuff. I made myself tea and settled into my office chair, but instead of opening client files, I began taking inventory of my life. Every business account, every investment, every asset I'd accumulated over the past 5 years. The numbers painted a stark picture of financial independence that Marcus's family couldn't even imagine. My consulting firm had contracts with 12 major companies across the Southwest. Ravens Park Ventures relied on my custom project management software. Kristen Global's entire data analysis system ran on programs I'd built from scratch. I had recurring monthly income that most families would consider retirement-level wealth. Yet somehow, I'd allowed myself to become invisible in my own marriage. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Forgot my lucky pen. Can you drop it off at the office around 2 p.m.? Big presentation today. Love you. I stared at the message, remembering similar requests over the years. Could I bring him lunch? Could I pick up his dry cleaning? Could I handle the house repairs while he focused on work? Small favors that seemed reasonable at the time, but now felt like symptoms of a larger problem. Instead of responding immediately, I opened my laptop and began researching something I'd never seriously considered before: what it would take to relocate my business. As a software consultant, I could work from anywhere with reliable internet. Most of my clients communicated through video calls and email anyway. Seattle kept coming up in my searches. The tech hub had a thriving startup scene, venture capital firms, and companies that might actually value my expertise. I found myself browsing apartment listings and office spaces, imagining a life where my work wasn't dismissed as computer stuff. Around noon, my mother-in-law called. "Eve, honey, I wanted to thank you again for hosting yesterday," Patricia said, her voice warm with the artificial sweetness she reserved for family calls. Marcus is so lucky to have someone who's willing to support his career goals. Support his career goals? I repeated. Well, you know, by handling the house and your little hobby business while he focuses on the important work. Not every wife would be so understanding about being the secondary earner. There it was again, the assumption that I was somehow lesser, that my contributions were insignificant. I found myself wondering if Marcus had actively fostered this belief or simply never bothered to correct it. "Patricia," I said carefully, "what do you think I actually do for work?" She laughed. "Oh, you know me, dear. All that computer talk goes right over my head. Marcus mentioned you help small businesses with their websites or something. Very sweet of you to have a little project." A little project. $400,000 in revenue last year was a little project. "Has Marcus ever told you specific details about my business?" I pressed. "Well, no, but why would he? Men don't usually discuss their wives' hobbies in detail. He's always been focused on the bigger picture, making sure you both have financial security through his career advancement." After I hung up, I sat in stunned silence. It wasn't just that they underestimated my success. They had no idea it existed at all. Marcus had crafted such a complete fiction about our financial dynamic that his own mother believed I ran some sort of charity website project. I pulled up our joint bank statements and traced the deposit patterns. Every month, my business income flowed into our shared accounts, while Marcus's commission checks seemed almost quaint by comparison. Yet somehow he'd maintained the narrative that he was our financial foundation. My phone buzzed again. "Did you find the pen? Really need it for the 3 p.m. meeting. This could be a huge commission." I looked at his message and realized something profound. I'd spent 5 years making his life easier, while he took credit for the stability I provided. The pen was probably on his desk at the office, but he'd rather have me drive across town than look for it himself. For the first time in our marriage, I deleted his text without responding. Tuesday morning brought another revelation. I was reviewing client contracts when I discovered something I'd forgotten: a non-disclosure agreement I'd signed with Lumetra Corp 6 months ago. They'd hired me to rebuild their entire customer management system, a project so complex that they'd insisted on absolute secrecy about their new competitive advantage. The contract was worth $200,000, paid in quarterly installments. I'd deposited the first $50,000 in March, but in the excitement of completing other projects, I'd never mentioned it to Marcus. As far as he knew, that money had come from my regular consulting work. I realized this wasn't the only significant income he didn't know about. There was the emergency database recovery I'd done for Zavora Technologies, $30,000 for a weekend's work. The mobile app I'd developed for a startup in Los Angeles, $45,000, plus ongoing maintenance fees. Multiple revenue streams that existed completely outside Marcus's awareness. This wasn't just about him taking credit for my success anymore. This was about the fact that I'd been financially independent for years without even fully realizing it myself. At lunch, I called my accountant, Janet, whom I'd been working with since starting my business. "Eve, good to hear from you," she said. "I was just preparing your quarterly reports. You're having an exceptional year." "Janet, I need to ask you something confidential. If I wanted to relocate my business to another state, what would be involved?" There was a pause. "Is everything all right?" "I'm just exploring options. Hypothetically, how quickly could I transfer my business operations?" "Well, since you're set up as an LLC and most of your income is from remote consulting, it would be relatively straightforward. The main considerations would be state tax implications and updating your business registration. Are you thinking about a specific location?" "Seattle. Washington has no state income tax, so that would actually be beneficial. You could probably complete the transition within 60 days if you were motivated. Is Marcus supportive of a potential move?" I found myself unable to answer that question. Marcus didn't even know the real scope of my business. How could I predict his reaction to relocating it? That afternoon, I decided to conduct an experiment. When Marcus came home from work, I told him I'd had a good day with clients. "That's great, babe," he said, grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. "What kind of projects are you working on?" "I finished a major database system for a corporation. The client was really happy with the results." "Cool. How much do those usually pay?" I watched his face carefully. This one was $50,000. Marcus nearly choked on his beer. $50,000? For what, like 6 months of work? 6 weeks. The silence stretched between us. I could see him processing the implications, trying to reconcile this information with his understanding of my hobby business. That's really good, Eve. I had no idea your projects were that substantial." "Marcus, how much do you think I make annually?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. I figured maybe 30 or 40,000, enough to help with expenses. Last year I generated $412,000 in revenue." The beer bottle slipped from his hand, clattering onto the kitchen counter. His face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, and something that looked almost like betrayal. "That's impossible," he said finally. "I would have known. We would have talked about it. We never talk about my work in detail. You always change the subject when I try to explain what I do. But that would mean you make more than—" He trailed off, the reality sinking in. "More than you. Yes, significantly more." Marcus stared at me as if seeing a stranger. In a way, I suppose he was. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had in our marriage. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, while I explained the reality of our financial situation. Every major expense, every family contribution, every safety net we'd enjoyed, it all traced back to my business income. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to, many times. You never seemed interested in the details. But this changes everything. This means I've been taking credit for my success? Yes." Marcus looked up sharply. That's not fair. I never claimed to make that kind of money. No, but you never corrected anyone's assumptions either. Your family thinks you're the provider. They think I'm some sort of dependent housewife with a cute computer hobby. My family doesn't understand business stuff. I was trying to keep things simple. Simple? Marcus, your brother joked about celebrating if I disappeared. Your mother calls my business a little project. They think I'm dead weight. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Nathan was just being Nathan. He makes jokes about everyone. This isn't about Nathan specifically. This is about the fact that you've allowed your entire family to believe a lie about who we are and what I contribute. So what do you want me to do? Call them all up and announce that my wife makes more money than I do? Emasculate myself in front of my whole family? There it was. The real issue. Marcus's ego couldn't handle the truth about our financial dynamic. He'd rather let his family disrespect me than admit I was the primary breadwinner. I want you to be honest, I said quietly. I want you to stop being ashamed of my success. I'm not ashamed. I'm proud of you. But there's a difference between being proud and rubbing it in everyone's faces. How is correcting their misconceptions rubbing it in their faces? Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started scrolling through messages. I have to respond to some work emails, he said, effectively ending the conversation. That night, I lay in bed listening to Marcus breathe beside me. Earlier, he'd made a show of working late on his laptop, but I'd seen him browsing social media and watching videos. He was avoiding me, avoiding the conversation, avoiding the reality that had just shattered his carefully constructed narrative. I thought about Nathan's words again. If you vanished today, we'd probably celebrate. The more I considered it, the more I realized he might have been right, but not for the reasons he thought. They'd celebrate because they believed Marcus would be free to find a better wife, someone who contributed more significantly to their family's success. They had no idea that my disappearance would trigger a financial collapse that would touch every member of their extended family. I pulled out my phone and quietly began researching Seattle real estate again. This time, I wasn't just browsing, I was planning. Apartments near tech corridors, office spaces for a growing consulting firm, moving companies that specialized in cross-country relocations. Marcus stirred beside me, and I quickly closed the browser. But my mind was already racing ahead, calculating timelines and logistics. If I was going to disappear, it would need to be executed flawlessly. No loose ends, no trail back to Phoenix, no opportunity for Marcus to manipulate the situation to his advantage. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself wondering what Nathan would think when he realized that his joke had triggered the exact scenario he'd described. Only this time, nobody would be celebrating. 3 weeks later, everything was in motion. I'd found a perfect apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, secured office space in a building full of tech startups, and arranged for a moving company to handle the transition. Marcus remained oblivious, too caught up in his own work drama to notice my careful preparations. On a Thursday morning, while he rushed off to another crucial sales meeting, I began the final phase of my plan. First, I transferred all business funds out of our joint accounts, moving them to a new bank in Washington state. The personal accounts I left untouched. Marcus could have his own money, but he could no longer access mine. Next, I called each of my major clients to inform them of my business relocation. The conversation with Lumetra Corp was particularly satisfying. Actually, we've been hoping you'd consider expanding to the Pacific Northwest, my contact said. We have several subsidiary companies in Seattle that could use your services. This timing is perfect. By noon, I'd secured enough new contracts to double my revenue within 6 months. Seattle wasn't just an escape route, it was a launch pad for the next phase of my career. The hardest part was calling Nathan's construction company. 6 months ago, when he'd needed financing for new equipment, Marcus had begged me to co-sign a loan. Nathan never knew I was the actual guarantor. He thought Marcus had somehow arranged the backing through his sales connections. "Hi, this is Eve Bennett," I said when Nathan's secretary answered. "I need to discuss the equipment loan I'm guaranteeing for your company." There was a long pause. "I'm sorry. I think there's been a mistake. Marcus Bennett is the guarantor on that loan." "Actually, I am. I'll be transferring the loan responsibility back to Nathan directly. He'll need to arrange new financing within 30 days, or the equipment will be repossessed." When she transferred me to Nathan, I could hear the confusion in his voice. "Eve, what's this about a loan? I thought Marcus handled all that business stuff." "Marcus doesn't have the credit or income to guarantee a loan of that size, Nathan. I've been the financial backing for 6 months. Since you think I'm expendable, you can handle your own business financing going forward." Friday evening, I loaded the last of my personal belongings into my car. The moving truck had taken my office equipment and furniture the day before, while Marcus was at work. I left behind everything he'd consider ours: the fancy kitchen appliances, the living room furniture, the decorative items his mother had given us. But I took everything that was truly mine: my computers, my business files, my personal mementos, and my financial independence. I left a note on the kitchen counter, next to the mortgage statement and utility bills. "Marcus, I'm taking Nathan's advice and disappearing. Since your family would celebrate my absence, I thought I'd give them what they want. You'll find that our joint business accounts have been closed. They were my accounts anyway. The mortgage and utilities are now your responsibility, as is Nathan's equipment loan, which I've transferred back to him. You're finally free to be the provider your family believes you are. Don't try to contact me. I'm starting over somewhere that values what I contribute. Eve P.S. You might want to explain to your family that your little computer hobby wife was actually your financial foundation. They're about to learn exactly what my disappearance means." I drove through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee. As Phoenix disappeared in my rearview mirror, I felt lighter than I had in years. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts from Marcus, but I'd already changed my number. The old phone would go in a dumpster somewhere outside Flagstaff. By Saturday morning, I was in Seattle, signing the lease on my new apartment. By Monday, I was meeting with potential clients who saw my expertise as valuable, not something to be minimized or hidden. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged. 6 months later, the consequences of my disappearance had rippled through the Bennett family like dominoes falling. Marcus had been forced to move back in with his parents after foreclosure proceedings began on our house. His sales commissions, which had seemed impressive when supplemented by my income, couldn't cover the mortgage payments alone. Nathan's construction business was struggling without the loan I'd guaranteed. He'd been forced to return the equipment and lay off half his crew. The family's planned reunion in Cabo had been canceled when Marcus couldn't contribute his usual share, money that had always come from my accounts anyway. Jessica had called everyone she knew, trying to track me down. Patricia had hired a private investigator, convinced that something terrible must have happened to make me abandon my marriage so suddenly. They couldn't comprehend that I'd left voluntarily, that their dismissive treatment had consequences. Meanwhile, my consulting firm had landed 3 major contracts with Seattle-based companies. Oakenlight Publishing was thriving in an environment that respected innovation and expertise. I'd been invited to speak at tech conferences, join professional organizations, and built relationships with other successful entrepreneurs. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nathan had been right about one thing. My disappearance had revealed exactly what my presence was worth, just not in the way any of them had expected. As I sat in my new office overlooking Elliott Bay, I couldn't help but smile at the memory of that family reunion 6 months ago. Nathan's cruel joke had been the catalyst for the best decision I'd ever made. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us exactly the push we need to claim our worth. I had disappeared, just as he suggested, but the only one celebrating was me.